Net zero immigration is the phrase more and more British people are using because, rightfully, they're sick to death of mass migration and the devastating impact it's had on our country.
More than 10 million immigrants have entered the UK over the past decade. Around 2,700 people every single day, relentlessly. That scale is not a few small towns. It is the equivalent of 9 cities the size of Birmingham being added onto the same system. Housing, hospitals, schools, policing all remain the same. The pressure does not. This is not about politics. This is a system standing at a red line. Decisions are signed in meeting rooms. Statements are read from podiums.
One nation experiment in open borders.
Far from street level where people earn a living every day. There is no policy adjustment. In reality, stable housing is no longer guaranteed for British residents. In London, foreign-born residents account for around 48% of the social housing supply. In the past 2 years, electricity prices up 52%, rents up 40%, food prices pushed beyond reach, public services locked into waiting lists with no clear end. Income does not follow, rising by less than 1% per year, again too thin to absorb any real risk. What is calculated on paper does not reflect what is happening on the ground. Paper stops at the meeting table. The consequences appear in everyday life. Stay with us as we examine how far everyday life in Britain has been pushed. The first warning signs do not come from emergency announcements. They appear in routine statistics. In areas hosting concentrated asylum accommodation, local police receive hundreds of calls each day related to public disorder incidents. On-the-ground forces can respond to only a small fraction of them. Priorities are forced to be cut back. In recent years, multiple serious criminal cases involving foreign nationals have been brought before UK courts, ranging from sexual assaults to knife-related violence. The issue is not nationality. The issue is the capacity for control and screening. When scale grows faster than management capability, law enforcement becomes fragmented. And that is when order begins to erode, not through chaos, but through the habit of acceptance. When tensions spill beyond the boundaries of policy, they move into public space. Across the UK, hundreds of protests have taken place and continue to take place around hotels being used to house asylum seekers. In Epping, Essex, protests lasted for weeks, forcing police to deploy reinforced units almost every night. According to local authorities, the cost of security, police overtime, and public order control in the area has already exceeded hundreds of thousands of pounds, with further costs accumulating each time tensions resurface. In Rotherham and Nottingham, asylum accommodation sites have repeatedly become flashpoints for large gatherings. Streets have been temporarily closed, public transport routes have been diverted, nearby shops and restaurants close early or suspend operations whenever tensions escalate. Lost revenue is not compensated. The damage is not limited to property. It is felt in disrupted daily life. Residents avoid going out in the evenings. Families adjust their routines. Areas that were once quiet become places requiring heightened awareness. Each protest is handled as an isolated incident. But when the same pattern repeats across multiple locations, it is no longer an isolated event. It becomes a sign of a society paying a steady price for a prolonged imbalance. The deepest impact is not found in the protests. It lies in dreams. The desire for home ownership among British people has not become harder over time. It has disappeared. The deposit for an ordinary home now exceeds many years of savings. Working people have given up on that dream. Renting is no longer a temporary phase. It has become a prolonged condition. As the dream of stability fades, it triggers postponement, marriage, having children, building a future. Even full-time workers are forced to calculate every step. A single disruption, job loss, illness, a sudden rise in costs is enough to push them into insecurity. There is no sudden collapse, only a spreading sense that everything is slipping beyond personal control. And when an entire generation no longer believes that a stable life can be built through their own labour, this is no longer just an economic issue. It becomes a fracture in the social contract. What is most striking is not the scale of the pressure, but how little of it is formally measured. Population growth, housing demand, service capacity, and policing strain are all discussed. Yet few concrete operational limits are ever published. There is no publicly defined threshold indicating how much additional pressure a local system can absorb before performance degrades. There is no binding trigger that forces policy to pause, adjust, or reverse. Instead, decisions are signed sequentially, each treated as manageable in isolation, while their combined impact remains untested. Central government controls the pace of intake, but responsibility for the consequences is pushed downward. Councils absorb housing pressure, GP surgeries absorb patient surges, police absorb rising call volumes. None of these bodies control how quickly demand arrives. This separation between authority and accountability creates a structural blind spot. When strain builds, it is absorbed quietly at the edges of the system through longer waiting times, reduced service scope, and lowered expectations. The system does not collapse, it degrades. And degradation is harder to detect because it happens gradually, without a single failure point. By the time problems are acknowledged, they are no longer emerging risks. They are embedded conditions. A resilient system is not defined by perfection, but by margin. Time to respond, capacity to absorb shocks, room for error without triggering cascading failure. That margin is now thin. Local services operate close to maximum load. Budgets assume stability. Staffing assumes predictability. In this state, a crisis is not required to cause disruption. A colder than expected winter, a temporary accommodation shortage, a funding delay, or a single high-impact incident can push a stretched system from strain into dysfunction. Not everywhere at once, not dramatically, but locally, unevenly, and persistently. This is why pressure feels constant even without a declared national emergency. There is no slack to absorb surprise and no reserve to offset miscalculation. Policy continues to function on paper, but operational reality has become brittle. When systems lose elasticity, their failure mode changes. They no longer break loudly, they erode quietly. That erosion creates uncertainty for workers, families, and communities trying to plan even a few months ahead. Sustained uncertainty is itself destabilizing. This is not a story about numbers alone, nor about ideology. It is a lesson about alignment. Between policy ambition and delivery capacity. Between national decisions and local impact. Between long-term consequences and short-term fixes. When population growth outpaces infrastructure, pressure does not distribute evenly. It concentrates in housing queues, GP waiting lists, classrooms, patrol gaps, and eventually in public trust. A system can absorb imbalance for a time by asking people to adapt, to wait longer, and to accept less. But adaptation has limits. When those limits are crossed, people do not immediately revolt. They withdraw. They delay plans. They lower expectations. That quiet withdrawal is harder to measure than protest, but far more corrosive. The lesson is not that policy must stop, but that it must be bounded, measured against real capacity, adjusted before strain becomes routine, and transparent about trade-offs. Because once a society normalizes operating at the edge, it loses the ability to rebuild margin. And without margin, every future decision carries greater risk than the last. That is the line now in view.